by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Turrbal people and the Yuggera people, and pay respect to their ancestors who came before them. Today, we are proud to present Sustainable Supper as part of our Deep in the Conversation program and an entree to the Ideas Festival 2011, which will be held here at the State Library of Queensland from the 20th to the 22nd of May. The Deep in the Conversation program is a series of talks, debates and conversations with leading thinkers designed to share and stimulate ideas. The Ideas Festival 2011 will feature an innovative and interactive program focused around the themes of food futures, sustainability and happiness. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Professor Geoffrey Lawrence to facilitate this exciting discussion. Geoff is a Professor of Sociology and a co-leader of the Global Change Institute's Food Security Focal Area at the University of Queensland. He is the author of many books and papers on the social aspects of agriculture and food. His most recent co-edited book, Food Security, Nutrition and Sustainability, was published last year by Earthscan London. There are actually flyers about this book on just as you walk out to your left, on a platform there. Joining Geoff in tonight's discussion is Tim Lang and Geoff Wilson. Tim Lang is a permaculture gardener and land management specialist with more than 20 years' experience. He works with Northeast Street City Farm, teaching the schools and the community how to grow food sustainably in the city. Geoff Wilson was an agribusiness, agroforestry, aquaculture and urban agriculture journalist in Australia and the West Pacific for 50 years. He has since founded various sustainability-focused organisations such as Green Infrastructure Network Australia, Cuponics Limited and the World Green Roof Infrastructure Network. He is currently the Director of Aquaponics, President of the Green Infrastructure Network Australia and Australian Director of the World Green Infrastructure Network. Before we start, may I please remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones and to also use the back exit at that area there if you wish to leave during the talk. We are audio and video recording this talk for the library website tonight, so if you have any questions about this procedure, please come and see me or one of the library staff following the event. At the end of our discussion tonight, there will be an opportunity for people to ask questions. Please wait until the microphone gets to you so we can all hear your question clearly. Please join me in warmly welcoming Geoff, Tim and Geoff.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to so many people for coming along tonight. What I'll do is to talk through about 5 pertinent questions with Tim and Geoff, and then we'll have some questions from the audience. Hopefully we'll talk for about 30 minutes and it then opens up. Global food security is one of the big issues of our time, and I'll just give some background on this. Of the 6.8 billion people in the world today, about 1 billion, just over 1 billion, are chronically hungry. We're also expecting another 2 billion people to join us by the year 2050. This is going to place major constraints on the ability of the world to feed these people. There's not so much arable land going to be available. In the 1960s, there was about 0.5 hectares per person of arable land available. It's now half that, 0.25. We know that there are shortages of water. There'll be chronic water shortages. People won't have access globally to the sort of water they've been used to. And irrigated agriculture will have to become much more efficient and much more sustainable in its practices. We also know that climate change will have impacts. Climate change, if it's kept down to 2 degrees, and we wonder whether we can do that or not, will have major problems about flooding of various countries. But if it goes beyond that, we could see in our own region, Bangladesh, India and so forth, up to 200 million people who will be climate change refugees. We're also seeing the plateauing of agricultural productivity. We're just not getting those gains now that we used to get in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, and we could go into that later if people are interested. The other thing is that we're having speculation in foods. with global neoliberalism and the opening up of markets, and also the collapse of the dot-com boom that happened in the early 2000s, speculative capital has been looking to invest. It now realises that the earth is a fairly scarce commodity, and what it's going to do is invest in that. All of these things point to real constraints on the ability of the world to feed people in the coming decades. But we live in Australia. Australia at the moment feeds its 22 million people and has enough food to feed 40 million people abroad. That's a lot of people to feed. So the question I'd want to start with is, even though we've got those global constraints and problems, should we be worried about food security in Australia? Is it going to be a problem for Australia? What do you think, Geoff?
I think we should be very worried about it because there's lots of factors involved, as you mentioned. The factors I see as extremely important is the cost of energy. The cost of energy, starting on the farm and moving through to the supermarket chain or the supermarket system, is crucial. We're finding that farmers are facing higher costs for everything they buy, and their cost of production is rising, and you will have noticed that recently as a result of the floods, as a result of the cyclone. We haven't had the ability to replace food produced naturally. I have a very great view that we have to go into not unnatural means of growing food, but we have to control our food production, because a lot of what we face at present is uncontrolled farming. When I say uncontrolled farming, the opposite of that is protected cropping. And in protected cropping, we can dispense with all the problems that farmers face. And there's a whole list of those. That document that I handed out, or didn't hand out, but I had at the door, is a paper I prepared thinking this was a paper session rather than being question and answers. But that document lists those problems. And the problems are going to be faced by all of us if we're urban farmers or whether we're rural farmers. The climate that may be there may not be suitable to grow a lot of things, and that will restrict our ability to grow our own food. We have to respond to that problem, otherwise I think we're going to be in desperate circumstances in many parts of the world. And I'm talking about this worldwide because it is a worldwide problem. Australia has a surplus of food which we export. And I've worked for commodity boards in wool and dairy, and we earned a lot of money overseas, and most of our revenues were coming from overseas markets. That's changed considerably in the last 10 to 15 years, and I think we're now facing problems that involve with water. Water is key. Without water we can't produce anything, we can't live. We might live a month without water, but water after a couple of days is a desperate problem, not having it.
Tim, what do you think about this? Have you got any views about whether or not we have a food security problem in Australia?
Well, obviously we're growing food for 60 million people. We don't currently have the problem. The issue I have with it is the potential for a big problem when our agricultural system and a lot of our lifestyle and our society is underpinned by the cheap availability of fossil fuels. So it takes a lot of oil to produce food, from land preparation, machinery manufacturing, running machines, processing, harvesting, distribution. But it's the waste side of that I think is a real issue. I mean, apparently we're wasting 40 to 50% of all the food produced in Australia domestically. So we're just throwing it away at the kitchen sink, but a lot of it is being thrown away before it even gets to the shops because it has a spot or there is one issue or another with it. So if we could deal just with the waste, we would have much less, we would be buying time, as it were. But if our agricultural system is underpinned by fossil fuels, and societies generally are underpinned by agriculture or their ability to feed themselves or to be fed, then that's the really basic thing for me, is to say, well, we're relying on a whole future from material which we know to be finite and becoming harder to get. We don't know how much of this amazing stuff that there is, oil, but some people have some ideas. However, we do know it's going to be harder and harder to get and become more and more expensive. And there are ways of growing food without it. I mean, we all stand here as a result of a very, very long history of human agricultural activity prior to the First World War and the Second World War, and a lot of military technology developing into agricultural technologies. We know what to do. I just fear that we might lose those skills and that knowledge about how to grow agriculture. And just before I finish, if we think of China, for instance, has a massive population now, and it might be double to what it had prior to the Green Revolution, but it was relatively a massive population then too. Almost all the food grown locally and organically before massive chemical input. So we do know how to feed a lot of people in very small areas with organic or limited input systems. So I'm always, as a permaculturist, I also like to talk about LISA, which is limited input sustainable agriculture, as a way forward.
What specific issues do you think Australia will face in feeding its population and trying to provide these foods for the rest of the world, Tim?
Look, this is a really difficult... The first thing that comes to my mind, and I don't want to be seen as a boogeyman or the devil's advocate at all, but I have to ask the question, is it really our responsibility to feed the world? Now, I feel as an affluent nation, it is our responsibility to get involved in the well-being of the planet generally, of which all humanity is part. So we're talking foreign aid. I think it's much more useful to empower communities to work towards local self-reliance, as we can do ourselves. There's an interest in local food security. The idea of just producing massive amounts of food to feed other people can engender dependencies, but also, again, that loss of skills and knowledge that is the basis of agriculture, our interrelationship with the landscape that can feed us. I just want to point out on that is that right now in the Ivory Coast there's this huge conflict going on. Africa isn't an incredibly abundant place. I don't know if people have travelled there who has, but a lot of Africa is amazing Garden of Eden, sure, in the high rainfall areas of northwest Africa there. The Ivory Coast produces the most cocoa, so chocolate, and one of the largest producers of coffee. For sure, this conflict is related to the money that comes from those resources. They are agricultures, those products, but they're not exactly food. So I just want to point that out, that I think there's a very close link between conflict and agriculture, and also food, and then the resources required for agriculture, particularly energy and water.
Thanks very much, Tim. Geoff, what's your view on that? What specific issues will Australia need to face in the future to provide food for its own people and to sell food abroad?
I think one of the basic things is education. Education gives us the ability to respond sensibly to a lot of things. One of the things that I've been an agribusiness journalist for more than 50 years now, and it's been quite obvious that the loss of our individual ability to grow our own food has been alarming. In the world I was a teenager in, most of us knew how to grow vegetables in the backyard. These days I don't think many people do. There's certain exceptions, such as where my daughter used to live in Coburg. Almost everybody grew their own food in the backyard. It was a tradition of Italians and others to do that and do it well. I think the permaculture movement has got this ability too, to have more food grown by ourselves. And it's fresh, healthy food. It's food without, if you do it properly, without the problems that the chemical industry has given us, with an extra 25,000 different chemicals since the Second World War. What's been happening as a result of that, I think it's a deep concern. Also, I think our nutritional responses as a result of education can be enormously better. We're being made aware now that omega-3 oils are crucial to our good health. That's only a recent, not a recent discovery, but a recent topic of concern. That in itself is something we should know more about so that we can choose those foods which have the right omega-3 oils, not the ones that we don't necessarily need. And I won't go into that, it's a bit complicated. There's also another problem I think we need to deal with, and that is the problems of diseases of plants and animals. If the climate changes as has been predicted, and I do believe very strongly in that, our livestock animals and our plants upon which they feed and which we feed are going to be more susceptible to disease. They can be counteracted with breeding to breed resistance, but that's a very long-term process. It's probably a longer-term process than the climate change that may occur suddenly and with intensity. CSIRO this week said that cyclones are not going to be so frequent perhaps, but they're going to be a lot more intense. And that, as we well know, is a terribly destructive thing to be facing.
Can I just add to that too? One of the things that the CSIRO and others have predicted with climate change is the drying of the continent. There might be some movement for grains up north into soils that have been suffered from salinisation, so that's not going to be too good. The west will dry out, the wheat areas around Perth and inland. Cane toads and other things, diseases will move south. There's also the issue that there'll be less water for irrigation, and of course it's irrigation that's provided the basis for a lot of Australian agriculture. 70% of our water is used in irrigated agriculture in Australia. The other thing is that if there's going to be more than a 2% increase in temperature because of climate change, something like 30% of pastures will be compromised, and that will lead to about a 40% decline in livestock. Now, part of the problem of livestock is that they create methane and various other things, but Australia's relied on the export of those animals. So there's going to be major changes, as you're saying, Geoff, with climate change, and we don't quite know what this is going to mean right now.
They're not well. Sorry, I should be. On to the next question. They're not well talked about, unfortunately, or written about, because our news media is not well aware of these problems, or often not interested in reporting them. They're problems I foresee quite clearly because of the depth I've had in agribusiness journalism, and it's yet I'm at the end of my career. I'm not writing so much these days. I think it's something that we should stimulate more interest in by our news media, because that news media is our source of or can be a source of information and us doing things.
Yeah. One of the other things, of course, that happened in recent times, and we're all alive to know this, was Cyclone Yasi and what happened there, and the floods, of course. The flooding in Queensland and the cyclone, you'll know this because it came out in the media yesterday, was responsible for about an 11.3% increase in the price of fruit and vegetables. Now, if you're saying, Geoff, here that there's going to be more intense cyclones and other weather events, then we might have to get used to higher food prices. And, of course, that's going to hit budgets and it's going to be a problem for many people. What I'd like to do... Sorry.
I just wanted to add one, that the peak phosphate, we've heard of the climate change issues, even peak oil, but we're starting to hear about peak phosphate, so the finite availability of phosphate as a key agricultural input. But might be an issue for Australia, particularly that a lot of agricultural land is soils are phosphate deficient. But I don't know a lot about the details, but the gist of it is, I think, is that a lot of this phosphate, if it's not leached through the soil and into the waterways, which causes pollution, it goes into the plants. We eat it, that's fine, but then where does it go? Into the toilet, and it ends up in the ocean, where it's nobody knows how to get it back.
Yeah.
So
people have talked about the importance of getting a sort of closed loop for phosphates in particular as a necessity. Otherwise they just do leach and cause all sorts of havoc. But given that we're going to talk about sustainable diets and various other sustainable suppers for Queensland, it's worth asking the question, and I'll ask you first, Geoff, thinking about Brisbane and southeast Queensland, are there any specific problems this region will face in regard to food and food security in the foreseeable future?
Yes, I see water as a very fundamental problem. And we don't have to think very far back to see the problem that lack of water causes and the problem that too much water causes. And yet we don't utilise our water efficiently. There's water falling on our rooftops that most often is just going down into the bay. There's also air moisture we can harvest. I don't know how many of you would have heard that there's it's been patented now for 2 years, a solar-powered air moisture harvester. And each time I mention this to a group of people I talk to, they suddenly see that they could be quite independent of municipal government supply. It doesn't make me popular with the municipal water people, but that solar-powered air moisture harvester can cost about $1,500. It's the same principle as a refrigerator or an air conditioner, and it can produce about 300 litres of water a day. Now, the average home would use about that amount of water a day, and it could be harvested from the air. It's not available yet, but it will be, I believe. That just gives you an inkling of what we could be looking at in future, a different way of approaching things. And it's the same with food production. Food production, in my view, is just about to take a rapid uptake of technology with what we call lead-lit lighting, that's light-emitting diodes, fed power by solar power, which can be made much more efficient by the cooling of greenery. There's a whole new design parameter we're looking at in our cities. Instead of cities being just structures and exuding heat, we can control that heat, we can control our environment much more. If we had 8% of green roofs across a city, we could lower the temperature 2 degrees in our cities. And if we went to 16%, I presume it's doubling. But that's the sort of thing we need to now look at in our city design, and have our city design there for food production as for ourselves where it's needed, close by, next to our kitchens. That's in prospect.
Tim, do you share the view that water is one of the main problems for southeast Queensland and Brisbane in the future?
Yeah, well, water-wise gardening is a pretty hard sell these days with the last few months. For sure, swings and roundabouts. We'll be back in a drought at some point in the future. Maybe, no doubt. Hopefully not, but anything can happen. But having a look at historically, for sure, we'll go back into a drought, and how long it will last for, I don't know, and maybe it won't even start for 5 years. It might rain. From a permaculture point of view, permaculture really errs on the side of perennial fruit and nut crops, so trees. And trees are very good at harvesting water, and in denuded landscapes we can use earthworks to harvest water, run off water and prevent erosion, and trap that in trees that provide products for us and create shelter and so forth, which then further mitigates against evaporation and so forth. Water and soil, were you asking one of the questions before, Geoff, was about what sort of problems we see in southeast Queensland that might relate to food security issues. There's a couple of points I would like to make. One is the inappropriate development, particularly urban sprawl. It still goes on, and in some of our best soils. And we've already built houses in some of Brisbane's and South East Queensland's best soils. I think this is a drastic mistake, and the solutions to that really need to come from people who are buying houses for the consumer, but also from government through legislation, but coming from planners. So we need planners to say, no, it's not appropriate to build houses, particularly, and we'll use the word inappropriate again, architectural technology, materials and so forth for our housing that are incredibly energy consumptive. I think that's a problem. On that this is really hard to swallow for a lot of people, but I think one of the issues we have is affluence, is where, like our agricultural system, it's relying on fossil fuels, and Australia is an incredibly affluent country, and a lot of that money is coming from digging it up or cutting it down. I mean, or like Geoff said before, speculation. So, there's a lot of people with multiple houses and so forth, and, sure, I'd love that too. However, I think that the lifestyle that we're afforded when we become overly wealthy is, it's more overconsumption and waste. So we're buying new cars all the time, flat screen TVs, we're throwing them out, brand new computers, all this sort of technology with rare earths where people are being exploited to procure the stuff for us is wasted. So how that relates to food security for me is the ease of going to one or two of the major food suppliers who control the retail side, so the duopoly, who also incidentally now control most of the retail of our petrol, which we all seem to be quite addicted to. This I see as a major problem with a dumbing down effect on our populace, that having, it's hard to say having too much money, but I just see it every day. I just see waste, and status becoming so important. But however, if we said that you couldn't have food for a week because there was none, then all of that would fall away very quickly. Very quickly. And so we don't have a food security issue at the moment. In a way, I'd like to see one, because it could bring about sanity. And if you remember the drought that happened in Brisbane, Brisbaneites can do this. When that drought happened, it was almost one of the, again, it's an oxymoron in a way. It's one of the best things that ever happened to us. We reduced our water use radically. I couldn't believe it. I thought, wow, what a fantastic mob of people. Now that we have this abundance, let's not go back to the outrageous wastage habits. But let's apply that same sort of caring attitude, if you like, to the rest of the world or the rest of the bioregion and so forth, and other people, that we might not actually be directly seeing the effects or the damage of our wasteful consumptive lifestyles.
Okay, that's great. You talked about urban encroachment. Do either of you want to talk about that as an issue for South East Queensland and Brisbane?
If I could go on. Sure. I came to Brisbane for the first time in 1942, but for the second time in 1992. And it was remarkable to me the changes that had occurred in the Redlands. The Redlands is a prime agricultural production area, and it's being destroyed by housing. And that to me is... I've seen that around the world. We've all been doing this, and we need to look very carefully at it, because we're running out of good agricultural land. The productivity of that land is not declining as yet, but it's starting to. But the water that's on the agricultural land is crucial, because without water we can't grow things. We all know that, but we ignore it so often. And the world is running out of easy water, and we're running out of the ability to feed a population of 9 billion in the latter half of the century. When I was a teenager at high school, the world had 3 billion people. I think it's incredible that I'm now at the end of my life and we have more than 6 billion. We've had a doubling of the population. Have we had a doubling of food? Yes, we have. It's technology that's allowed us to do that. But it's an industrialised system which is not going to work if we're going to be under threat from climate change and other factors. And other factors are the very climate change factors that are causing the climate change factors. That's petroleum, coal, natural gas use that is increasing the carbon dioxide content of the air. And it's not just the air. I've been looking at what's been happening with seas. The seas that we have are being acidified by more carbon dioxide going into them. And that's got huge ramifications that we hardly talk about.
Sure.
These are things that we're going to have to face in future, and I do believe they will be, or could be, well faced by each of us having food production systems of some kind. Now, they could vary enormously. They can be labour intensive, as is in permaculture, and there's a great enjoyment of that. There's a great psychological benefit of associating with greenery. It's a huge benefit, actually. We can also have food production within very well thought out systems that utilise the new technology of aquaponics, which is one I've been writing about for the last 30 years. When I say new, it's a newly developed system. It's thousands of years old. The Chinese used it very simply in rice crops, where they also grew fish, and the fish gave nutrients to the rice, and the Aztecs used it until the Spaniards struck them down.
So, Geoff, this is what you're saying here is these are some of the clues for providing us a sustainable supper for the people of Brisbane and South East Queensland.
Yeah, I believe
Have
so.
you got any other thoughts on that? What your mix would be of things to provide this sustainable supper?
There's a range of things, and they're being undertaken already. I used to be a member of the American, I forgot what it's exactly called now. It's an American group of growers that had more than 100 people each. They were urban growers of food, in the same as occurred in England during the war, where they had allotments, almost allotment farming, but it's different in America. There's about 3,000 of them in American cities. You hardly hear about them. They are producing urban food for themselves, and in depressed cities like Dearborn, where the motor industry's gone a bit...
Detroit, particularly.
Yes, particularly that city. But all cities of America are doing this. As I said, there's 3,000 of those communities. We're starting to have those sort of community developments here in Australia, but they're not necessarily always encouraged by municipal government. Here in Brisbane they are, I think, well encouraged. You testify to that, I suppose. But
Brisbane City Council is pretty much positive in getting on board with the supportive of the development of community gardens. Yeah, I mean, and that's only very recent. I know I went to the North American Community Gardens Conference in Toronto 5 years ago. Toronto being comparable size to Brisbane, there's a couple of million people. They had over 100 community gardens, many rooftop gardens, fantastic systems of food that was overproduced being gleaned and put through soup kitchens and so forth. Their whole household recycling systems are really high-tech and amazing. At that time, this Toronto City Council had a charter to support the development of community gardens, particularly to provide organic food for the needy. And I came back from that conference and we were to the council, this is a good idea. Brisbane City at that time pretty much had Beeralong and Northey Street City Farm. There's only 2 community gardens, and the council wasn't really on board with getting on with the job of it. And they are now, so there's going to be a lot more community gardens in Brisbane. I think we're going to talk a bit more about that a bit after. So.
Do you have any other options for the sustainable supper for Brisbane and South East Queensland? Anything that we've not talked about that you think is crucial or fundamental to provide that sort of sustainable supper?
We need a population who really wants that. So, and then that would happen. But I think it's also identifying the resources, the opportunities, and then also the limitations within our bioregion or locally. So that harks back a bit to preventing inappropriate housing development. But it's also identifying good spots to grow food. I mean, one thing I've noticed about a lot of community gardens, because that's obviously one of the solutions, and also backyard gardening. But permaculture generally, and I'll sort of have a bit of a dig at permaculture, is that often it, there can be incredibly diverse gardens that have a little bit of a lot of things. and maybe not the ability to provide a sustained amount of nutrient or calories, if you like, every day. Okay, so this is an issue that I think, if it really came to local food security within the Brisbane bioregion, then we would be looking at farms that look a bit more like market gardens and a bit more traditional type of vegetable growing, if you like. I would be one to promote more of the tree, fruit and nut crops, as well as the perennial plants. So this leads me to this thing about having a population that wants to do this, is I believe that we need to move towards a different type of food culture, one that is more aligned with our geographical location, which is essentially Asia, and have a look at Polynesia and Melanesia and the South Pacific generally, and in this climatic zone, and have a look at what have people been eating there and how do they grow those foods, and also, particularly New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, where there is an amazing abundant variety of bananas and cassava and sweet potato and taro and other perennial green foods, perennials as in long-lived. So you plant an orange tree, it's a very little amount of effort. You get a lot back for many, many years. There's a problem with annual agriculture and our expectations at the supermarket for year-round broccoli, carrots, cabbages, onions, all of these, it's a generalisation, but that our diet we expect. That costs more energy in terms of calories, if you could even equate oil to calories, remembering how much oil it takes to grow food, than we actually get back. So that's the base unsustainability, whereas the perennial food cropping systems, the intensive stacking systems that emulate the ecological functions of forests are incredibly productive and can happen in very small areas. So this is what Geoff was mentioning about permaculture being very good at growing abundance in small areas, but we do need to practice it and get better at it.
Okay. We also need to look at commercial development because, in my view, those annuals that you're talking about can be produced very well indeed, more cheaply than we do at present, in systems in our cities. What we face at present in our supermarket system is food coming in from all over the world, from all over Australia, into central depots. It's a centralised system which I've seen some stupidities occur. For example, one that I'm very familiar with was a strawberry farmer at Swan Hill in Victoria. This is years ago. He was producing strawberries for Woolworths. He was sending them down, I think it was about 250 k's, down to Melbourne, and they were coming back into his local supermarket. And that, because it was more efficient and less costly to do that at that time. But we're now facing a higher cost of energy, transport energy, that is going to kill a lot of farming in terms of its costliness. That's both in terms of the cost of farmers having water onto those sort of crops. With beef and grains, it's a different proposition. But where you've got use of water in agriculture, I think we're going to be very limited in future as to what we can import from vast distances, because the energy cost, the cost of buying diesel fuel from overseas is going to make that food cost enormously more than it is at present, and it's high enough at present. What
Geoff,
we can do, though, if I can just finish, is have localised production of food in systems that are now coming onto the market, and I can't say much more than that because my company is involved in it.
Right. Well, you and Tim have given us some options there. From your perspective, who's responsible for actually delivering this sustainable supper to Brisbane and South East Queensland? Is it government? Is it industry? Is it communities? Is it individuals? Who is it that's going to be able to help develop a sustainable future? First. Tim?
Well, all of that.
Oh.
Yes. In our current economic system, then it really is the consumer that needs to make the choices and drive innovation and change. However, I do need to say something about the current economic system, is that it relies on growth. there is no such thing as sustainable growth over the long term. So you can sustain growth now and tomorrow, and maybe we can sustain the type of economic growth we've been having for the next 100 years, but at some point it will collapse. So that's undoubted, unless we find other ways to keep ourselves wealthy and make money. But it's not going to be on oil and coal and even gas. Maybe it'll keep us going for a long time. These are the inhibitors to societal change towards local food culture is, again, that we have very, very cheap energy that's doing this all for us. I think it really is up to the consumer to decide. But I would love to also see legislation. I would love to see governments lead. Very, very difficult thing to do. Imagine if the Julia Gillard comes out with, well, I'm going to put the brakes on the economy. And she would be out. And that'll happen to Kevin Rudd. One mention of a mining tax, boom, you're out. Sorry, mate, but nobody wants that. It goes to show who's really in control here. Well, my personal opinion is tax them to the max. This is our sovereign wealth, and we can conserve it for for a higher use. I don't have a problem with the use of fossil fuels to use it as a tool to work our way out of this problem. But by generation of technology and so forth. But we must recognise the positive feedback loop of how pollution causes climate change and those issues that come with that. So.
Focusing on the consumer is a little bit individualistic and puts it back to individual decision-making. What do you think, Geoff? Is it about the individual? Is it about consumer? Is it about government? Is it about industry? People have talked about greening of industry, for example.
We mentioned before, it's about all of us. And that includes government. Government is really us when you analyse it. And it's also commercial companies. They're motivated by the search for the dollar. It's an economic equation they're involved in. But really, it's down to us. We are the choosers of what we do. And if we choose to go into high use of say, coal or petroleum, we must bear the consequences because we are using it. And it's also us, in other terms, which has political difficulties for a lot of people to talk about, and that is the population. We have a population which is out of control. And when you look at biological systems in the world, when a population's out of control, its destiny is a bit uncertain. And that's what we're facing at present. Our whole destiny, affecting our whole planet, is under question. And all we're having at present is arguments, as I said in the news media, arguments about things which are of concern to those people who want to maintain those high costs of doing things, high costs to us, not just to us personally, and this is why I'm most interested in doing what I'm doing, high cost to our children and grandchildren and their forebears. We have an essential duty to them as well as a duty to ourselves.
Thanks, Geoff. So there's the background to a sustainable supper for Brisbane and SEQ. I'm sure we've got people in the audience who are experts and who've got some very important questions to ask and to discuss. So please, do you have any questions? Do you have any points to make? Would you like to discuss or debate with members of the panel? Please put your hand up first, and please wait till the microphone comes to you and then talk away. Any questions to begin with or comments? Any people?
Stunned.
Stunned, yeah. People got problems with population growth, for example? Question up to that.
Thanks. In absence of anyone else asking questions, I have two just in case you have time. The first one is you haven't mentioned anything about, land grabs for agricultural land, China buying land in Africa and Australia, and last week the food advisor to the Prime Minister mentioned that buying land in Mozambique would be a great idea for Australian food security, and that kind of runs counter to food sovereignty. But also, you've talked about a lot of issues, and I'm just wondering if you could really briefly summarise what are the key things that individuals can do in their own lives, in their shopping choices, in their consumption choices, for them to do to have a more sustainable food system, and what are the key issues to demand of governments to get this change?
Thank you. I might try and answer the first part of that question and then turn over to Tim and Geoff. I think it's fascinating what's going on in regard to what people have called land grabs. What's happening is private equity firms, merchant banks, sovereign wealth funds, particularly in money-rich but food-scarce areas, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Libya, are now starting to say, well, we've got to feed our people, and we haven't got the land, but there is land in sub-Saharan Africa or Canada or Australia, and we will invest there. Now, the interesting thing about this is we've had investment in a place like Australia. Of course, we've seen money move in and out. Economists call it foreign direct investment. It's a good idea, according to them, to move this money. The problem is, when you start to think about what's going on in some of these developing countries, is peasants who had access to land are now being forced off that land. They can't feed their families, and they become part of what is these new cities of slums all around the world. Now, sometimes governments in those countries see this as economic development and are pushing for more of that investment. I think it was Bob Hawke and Peter Costello together who went overseas and tried to get some of this Arab money to come and invest and buy Australian farms. They did that at the start of this year. So, it's a very interesting thing about whether this is seen as economic development for the future or whether it's seen as some sort of land grab. And to counter the notion that it's a land grab, we're seeing the development of a big social movement globally called food sovereignty. And it's to get capital out of those countries to give people access to the food that they are growing, instead of growing things like biofuels, palm oil, whatever it might be, to ship back to these other countries. I think we're going to see that development, those issues, become much more focused over the next year or two. But the second part of the question was really, what can we do? Summarise what we could do locally to make a difference.
I think your personal choice is terribly important. And we've seen this in supermarket buying. The supermarkets service you with the things that you're buying and accepting. They won't sell you things that you're not interested in buying. They've got some pretty good testing regimes, and they're well ahead of us in terms of being a consuming population. They're well ahead in knowledge. I do believe they've yet to investigate what could happen if each of us chose to produce more of our own fresh food in or around our own homes. That gives us true economic security because we don't need as much money to earn a living and to have buy things. But the supermarkets are there at present, as you will have observed in over the last 25 years. They've gone massively into fresh produce, and it's a costly process they've gone into. It's a costly distribution process that I think is unsustainable, and it's one that's going to be best addressed in terms of its food security aspect by each of us having the knowledge or at least a unit that we can control of producing our own food. And is that essential? If you look at what just happened in Japan, it is essential, because the Japanese found that they did not have the food in the areas where the tsunami hit, and they had real problems. That might still have occurred, of course, but if the population has its own food security within our families, we are in a far better position to survive. The problems of this world that are going to happen, I believe, are going to happen, I said, in terms of climate change. There's lots of uncertainties, yes, and what will happen is not yet, we don't yet know. But secondly, the political problems ahead in terms of what might happen to the United States. The United States faces right now a situation where it will not have the world's reserve currency, and the dollar might be displaced by another currency of China or India or whatever.
But what about at the local level? Maybe, Tim, can you answer that question up the back there?
Okay. Yes, right. So one of the first things we need to do is to give Coles and Woolies the boot in terms of where we choose to put our dollar, and I think it's a terrible thing that they're doing in the dairy and eggs. So I would prioritise localisation of what you consume. So how do you do that? One thing is to activate for labelling at supermarkets about provenance, and to find ways of connecting consumers to producers, and that can be by having websites here's the apples, here's the producer's website, you can find out more about who they are, what they're up to, how they manage their land. So that's one way. Another way is to get involved in a box system, which is like Food Connect, where there's an organisation that might facilitate the delivery of local food to your door or to a house nearby. There's community-supported agricultural systems where groups of people will effectively employ a farmer to grow food for them seasonally, so there's a direct connection from the consumer to the producer. There's community gardens and allotments, if you're short of space, but it's also great to get involved in those even if you do have space in your own backyard in terms of community development and meeting other people and sharing those tasks. Then it's backyard gardening. And there's some wonderful movements, like I know there's Brisbane.org, if anybody looks at it, there's a Perma Blitz movement, which is groups of people will go to each other's houses and develop sustainable permaculture, organic food growing gardens for each other. So it's a people's movement, and if you're looking for some inspiration, I do suggest that people see The Power of Community, a documentary on the Cuban experiments with urban agriculture, because it is absolutely remarkable what's happened in Cuba in the last 15 years with food production. And also then look at America. You think, well, that's a communist country, they can just tell them to grow food, you must grow food. Well, in a way that is true, but if you're hungry, you'll do it. But if you want to have a look at some possible more bleaker scenarios for Australia, then you only have to look at the US, and Geoff mentioned that some cities, let's pick Detroit, in the 50s I think had a couple of million people, it's down to about 1 million people, and it's in decline. Yet it has some of the world's largest urban farming systems. And they're really cranking it up right now, because when you've got a lot of unemployed people, you get all sorts of social problems and people can't access food. So you put those, as permaculturists, we look at the problem to see the solution. The problem is the solution. And food and hungry, bored people, let's grow food. And there's some fantastic things. So I just want to say on that back to this idea, I would love to see blocks of land in Brisbane and parts of our parks, our public parks that are currently aren't accessed all the time by people, to be used as allotments, community gardens, where it's actually in your face, it's visible, people know it's going on, it's there, and it looks like farming, and people are actively involved in that in a healthy lifestyle.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah. There's a question just down here in the front. With the microphone.
Peter. Tim and Geoff, thanks very much. I'm not knowledgeable in this area, but I get the feeling, talking about all the different aspects, water and food are basic, but there are a lot of other areas that we need to consider, like energy and things like that. And it goes beyond what you two know as well, from what I feel, things like thorium instead of uranium for nuclear power, which doesn't have any side effects or possibilities of warheads and things like that, but that's being dumped because it doesn't have those byproducts. And aspects of community garden that you mentioned, Tim, how many community gardens are there in Brisbane?
Including school gardens, there's about 51 that I got off on website. I'll just tell you.
What about non-school community gardens?
Okay, I don't know the exact number, But I have a list of community gardens with me here.
Yeah. My question is, what I'm getting to is, we're talking about ideas. Should we really be talking about cranking up the community involvement in, telling Coles what we want, or having more community gardens? And I was involved with someone who set up a community garden, and the things that they had to go through with the council was incredible, just to establish that community garden. I hope that's changed from what you've been saying.
Well, yeah, the council is becoming more and more supportive, but they always put, hoops and so forth. Yeah. The interesting thing about Northey Street City Farms, they just went ahead and started doing it.
Yeah, and I think that's what we should be doing. I think that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, you just go find a little bit of space, go do it.
But we need to move very quickly. What I'm asking is, are we going to fall too far behind in developing things, talking about ideas instead of really getting in there? And Geoff, you talked about harvesting water and things like that. That's been around for a little while, but not commercially. Should we be really getting into that? That's what I...
Can I tell you a little story which illustrates this problem? I had 35 lectures in the last 12 months to Rotary clubs. I'm a Rotarian. I was talking about water and food. I became terribly depressed at the results of those talks, or the lack of results. I've now changed my approach entirely, and I've developed a program with a local politician in Carindale, Steve Kilburn. Steve Kilburn is backing the Whites Hill State College to have a green infrastructure program which teaches our children and their parents what we're talking about. Now that to me is a far better thing for me to do, but what I'm saying is that it's us. It's you joining organisations to learn and to do things, to set up community groups. There's one that we haven't mentioned here that I addressed the other day. There was a meeting of 200 people like today. It's BOGI, B-O-G-I, Brisbane Organic Growers Incorporated. It has 600 members. It is a great group of individuals learning by their own interactions and with their newsletter and in other ways too. I was most impressed with that organisation. It's a large number of people. They could set up branches, for heaven's sake, around different elements of the city and still not lose terribly much in they gain more members. But it's really up to us as individuals to take action ourselves. I constantly urge people to do this because I'm only one person. There's only me for a few years yet. We need continuity in this. We need people dedicated and educated, and that's why I'm going now for education at high school level, which shows kids and their parents on the side what we need to now do, because we are facing, I believe, in the next 5 to 10 years, both an economic climate that's going to be very different and a physical climate that's going to be much different.
The Prime Minister's, I think it's called Science, Engineering and Innovation Council, released a report on food security in December last year, and they highlighted the importance of education and of community gardens. I mean, it was a very, very interesting report, and some of you might like to get hold of that. It's on the web and it's available. There's a question here, there's a question over there, and there's a question just behind.
My question was actually about what you thought the role of education was, which the two Geoffs have just started to touch on there. But I think this group maybe represents more of the concerned citizens who are sort of have some existing knowledge about the concepts of things like permaculture and maybe even aquaponics. But what do you think the role of education in translating these concepts to the wider community? And Geoff's talked a bit about something happening in schools, but just to a greater population component.
Just quickly, this PIMSEC report that's going to the Prime Minister, it's a report to her, and she'll make some decision about what to do. They're saying how important it's going to be to educate kids in school about growing foods, about understanding where foods come from, and about literally knowing about ecosystems. Now, whether or not that can be put into curricula, I don't know, but it seems like a pretty important idea. They're basically saying the education systems let us down when people don't know where their milk comes from, etc.
There is quite a lot of fantastic stuff happening in the school gardens movement, and lots of school gardens coming up, and lots of amazing teachers who are integrating curriculum through in the garden, so you can learn maths, science, English, everything in the garden. That needs to be supported, because obviously that's the thinking of our young people is the future. From a permaculture, in permaculture, we've seen in recent years the development of accredited permaculture training. So now there's a nationally accredited training in permaculture, which is, you can get government benefits, basically. What do they call that? When the OS study, Centrelink, so there is some support there. So there is accredited permaculture training. And then working back from that, there's a huge amount of, one-day or half-day workshops through to the Perma Blitz thing, which is a shared knowledge in community, to a permaculture design certificate courses. There's WWOOFing, of course, which is the Willing Workers on Organic Farms movement, which is a great way to gain knowledge and skills. And I just wanted to mention another thing I forgot before to mention about farmers markets, to support farmers markets in my list of ways to activate locally. I do have and three things to mention where people can get involved is the transition towns movement. Okay, that's so remember these, or jot these down and go home and Google them and have a look at what transition towns is about and where they are. And there are people involved in local food, agriculture, and also energy efficiency stuff. Cityfoodgrowers.com, is a community network link for things that are going on and where can you meet people and what's happening locally with you in your suburb. Also, brisbanelocalfood.ning.com, so that's .ning.com. So it's out there. Most of us, I'm only just getting onto the sort of technical savvy side of things, but most of us can do a Google search or something, which incidentally takes quite a lot of energy to do a Google search, so don't do too many. But it's out there. It's just a matter of accessing what's going on, and don't be afraid to meet people and get involved. Experiment, make mistakes. Cut that tree down that you planted in the wrong spot if you need to. Okay. Yeah.
I believe there's a question just over here.
You didn't mention health, but certainly, the ramifications of local food for one's personal health. Eating locally, eating seasonally, taking care and having concern for what you're putting in your own mouth and understanding how it affects and influences you. So, you didn't touch on that aspect, but certainly maybe you'd want to expand on the ramifications for one's physical, emotional and nutritional health.
If I may say something. I think obviously eating organic food is beneficial for your health. And growing your own food, physical exercise and the connection to earth is wonderful for you. I haven't talked about that because it's been the personal growth, the personal health movement is very, very strong, and a lot of people eat organic food for their own personal health. And you go into Coles and you can find lots of organic food in a can. It comes from Italy. So I really prioritise the local thing. Even if we had farms sort of in the peri-urban or the urban fringe of Brisbane that was cranking food in the conventional manner, how long would it take before the population said, well, I actually don't want that chemical on my food anymore? Because we would see it, we would smell it, we would see the results of it. Because we don't see it, we don't respond as consumers. So I like to really prioritise the local and get in and see it, be involved. Yeah, and reject I'd buy a conventionally grown tomato that was grown up the street before I'd buy a can of organically grown tomatoes from Italy. Yeah, just on an energy thing. The indigenous people of this country could be nothing else but extrusions of the landscape on which they walked, because they cannot procure food or elements, atoms, bits and bobs that build our body from anywhere else. the things that they put inside their body could only come from their immediate environment or traded very much locally. If you imagine this over thousands of years in the evolutionary development of the human being at a cellular level, then you are an extrusion of the landscape in which you walk. From the quantum physics point of view, it can only, we can extrapolate to say, well, there's an intelligence at that level. And we start, the earth is speaking to us, through us, is us, and vice versa. So we might make lots of mistakes in changing the landscape through fire or what have you, and this and that, but eventually it dawns on you that this is the way I will behave. That is appropriate for
Geoff,
the landscape.
Do you want to comment on
Yes,
that?
I would, because it's terribly important that all of us understand good nutrition much better. We're seeing the problem of obesity in our environment, and I'm suffering the same. That is a problem of ignorance, in my view, because if those people that are obese were taking better notice of... I'm obese because I'm a diabetic and I've got a few problems that occurred, but if those people were taking notice of nutrition advice, they would understand, and modern nutrition advice, meaning they understand omega-3s and their terribly great importance to our brain development and our approach to life and our happiness. They would understand not just the fact that we can grow food, but the growing of it in association with greenery is so important to us psychologically. There's two benefits of greenery, meaning plants, living plants in our environment. One is psychological, and that's coming up very strongly. I've been attending conferences in North America. The first I attended amazed me. The researcher was talking about what happens in intensive care wards. He studied every intensive care ward in Texas. He found that those intensive care wards which had greenery had a half a day to 2 days earlier recovery. That is significant. That's a saving of money for a start. But it was significant in that, to me, coming back home and seeing hospitals which had no greenery around an intensive care ward. And more recently, out of Sydney, and partly in Brisbane here, we've been looking at schools which have greenery in their classrooms and not having greenery in their classrooms, and comparing the results. The results in those classrooms with greenery in them, whether it was a small amount or a large amount, with just greenery, were astounding. There were a trebling or more of the results in better science understanding, better spelling, better mathematics. And we're starting to go into a program at Whites Hill State College at Carina to reinforce this, because we need to further understand it. And further also, out of Sydney, has been tests which are being done to show the benefits of even a small amount of greenery in taking volatiles out of the air, harmful volatiles. We have in our environment here included, I think, because it's fairly new, a lot of volatiles which are not necessarily beneficial to our health.
Geoff, I think we
and
might...
plants can take those out. Sorry, I'm
it's okay.
taking
We've got
that.
two final questions and then we'll break. No, I think one's the guy in the blue shirt, and then I think the other one was down here. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
There's been a lot of talk about fruit and vegetables. There hasn't been much talk about meat. Is that a sign that vegetarianism is an important part of a sustainable supper?
Can I tackle that
yeah,
one?
Of course.
I used to be a meat industry journalist, and I have a fairly good knowledge of the meat industry. I think red meat is essential for iron in our diet, but not necessarily in big quantities. So we need red meat. Our red meat, unfortunately, has been subject to our development as beef producers, etc. And we're finding that the omega-3 content of our meats has been a lot lower. For example, I've forgotten the figures, but if you have a beast that's on ordinary pastures, I'm talking about Victoria now, improved pastures, without weeds that have omega-3s in them, that the animals or access to algae, those beef or sheep or pigs or whatever will not have enough omega-3 in our diet from that meat. And it's even worse with feedlot beef. It's half the amount, again, lower, the omega-3s. And there's an omega-3, I'm getting complicated now, but there's omega-3, omega-6 balance. And that balance has been interrupted in our diet for the last 50 years.
So we do need some meat, but you're not certain about how much.
But I do believe we've got to address the omega-3 question as well.
Thanks, Geoff. Tim?
Yeah, look, diversity is the key. I think too much of a good thing, no matter how good for it, you know, a little bit might be. But we can go a bit over the top with our beef production in Australia. The rangelands, although might be fairly well suited to that type of animal, you know, how much is enough? I just want to... I saw a really great farming system at the Riverina TAFE, actually, when I was down there earlier this year in Albury-Wodonga, where they had African fat-tail sheep, which are self-shedding. They had drought-tolerant sheep being looked after by alpacas. I was going to say llamas. In terms of their security, and on the same property they had huge amounts of free-ranging chickens who were being shepherded by Marama dogs, and they were under acacia trees producing very, very high protein-rich wattle seed. So, and then they had extensive olive orchards and other fruit and vegetable gardens and all sorts of things going on. So straight away, the diversity within the one property was quite large. And there's not many landscapes, maybe none on the planet, that aren't integrated with animals. And if you think grasslands were co-evolved with herbivores, ruminants, in Africa particularly, it's there. If you take those animals out of that landscape, then you'll get a changed landscape. So I think there is a place for the use of animals, and I just want to be careful about that word use. I think that we can be over-exploitive of animals, and we need to be very, or I believe to be sensitive to their needs and move away from cruel systems and into more humane systems if we're going to integrate animals. But I think there's a lot of value in integrating animals into plant production systems, particularly for nutrition, soil nutrition.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
Christy's telling me that there's someone that desperately needs and has got the microphone, so we'll have that. One last question down here then, and then we might break. Okay.
It's not actually desperate, but I just wanted to say that my kids live a hand-to-mouth existence because they're university students, so they're not affluent, and they decided instead of eating imported 2-minute noodles that each person that moves into the house buys a chook or a chicken that comes from a battery. They save them from the battery system.
Do they then eat them?
No, they use all the eggs,
right.
And their garden is all trees and plants like wild rocket and lemongrass. So they can, so they can actually sustain a really good diet just with pulses and rice and things like that, and eggs for protein.
Did the sustainable diet you talked about have those 1-minute noodles in it? Did you say? No. Sorry,
No. They decided they didn't want to eat imported 2-minute noodles.
Okay.
So by eating, locally grown or Australian-grown rice and pulses, they supplement that with eggs from chickens that they've saved from battery.
In other words, you can do it in backyards of Brisbane.
Absolutely, they do it in an old house here.
And create your sustainable supper.
Yep.
Okay, thank you for that. One last question down the front here with the microphone. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's not a question, it's some information. I'm a high school teacher. I teach home economics and nutrition and cooking. And we're trying really, really hard to grow our own herbs. We also talk to the kids about not low GI necessarily, but low HI, low human intervention. The kids come to school and we've talked about the floods a lot and about how it's affected our food supply, and the things like, bananas are $12 a kilo. However, we do a lot of comparisons, and the kids do tables and charts about... I try to talk to the kids about nutritional value for their dollar. We compare cost of a banana, which is probably about $2 at the moment, compared to a can of Coke or a packet of Cheezels. We talk about natural food like bananas, apples have their own packaging. The packaging is biodegradable compared to, chemicals.
Did the kids get this?
Oh, yeah. And I say to my kids, you've been done a disservice. You've been brought up with this. I grew up, I'm 58, so I grew up with our orange trees in the backyard, the good life, and these kids don't know that. So I'm taking it very, very seriously, what I'm trying to do. I'm also doing that in textiles because we're recycling fabric in textiles. And, I totally agree with you about the affluence, but our kids, this generation knows nothing else.
Yeah.
But it's a battle and it's baby steps, but I know a lot of other home economics teachers are doing the same thing. Horticulture teachers are doing the same sort of thing. So there's lots and lots and lots going on in schools.
In other words, there's a lot of activity out there, and some of this resonates very well with what we've been discussing tonight.
The kitchen garden scheme's only in primary schools, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But lots and lots of stuff is being done.
Well, look, thanks everybody for that. I think we better leave it here, and we can talk outside if people want to talk. I think the thing is we're probably all ready for our sustainable supper, aren't we, right now? So we better get moving. I'd particularly like to thank Christy, who's hiding over in the corner there, for having organised all this tonight. She's done a splendid job. I want to thank Geoff and Tim for coming on stage and being part of this. For Emma as well for helping to have us here tonight and have the interest in food security and sustainable suppers. And I'd like to thank you as an audience for coming and sitting and listening and participating tonight. So thanks again.
Geoff. Put your hand up if you're growing some of your own food.
That's terrific.
That's a good question.
Thank you very much, Geoff, Tim and Geoff, for providing us with insight into sustainability and food futures. We hope you all enjoyed tonight's event and hope you will join us for our next Deep in the Conversation event in partnership with the Ideas Festival 2011 on Wednesday the 4th of May, called Harnessing Heat, the Future of Geothermal Energy in Australia. For more information about the other events held here at the State Library of Queensland and the Ideas Festival 2011, the program for the Ideas Festival, and to provide feedback on tonight's event, please visit our website or see our registration desk outside. This evening's event is also available for audio and video download on our website in about a week. And if you have any questions about that, please also contact us. Thank you again for all coming tonight, and we hope you enjoyed the evening. Thank you.
Sorry to cut you off at the end.
That's all right. No, you got to stop.
Yeah. And I was told...